Remembering the manufactured housing merchandiser. I don't remember the first time I put my hands on an issue of the manufactured housing merchandiser, but it was a long time ago. I think by the time I wandered into the industry in 1972, the publication had already been around for years and was well regarded in the industry as a source of a lot of industry chatter and information. Down through the years, the publication changed very little, had the same look, had more or less the same feel and appearance. It seemed as though the back page advertiser was always the same one, and most of the inside advertisers down through the years were essentially not changed much. In addition, it kept current on industry affairs, allowed people a place to write and vent on what they wanted to talk about in the industry, and that was a great contribution to the industry. Herb Teeter, wonderful man that he was an industry legend who was the publisher of the merchandiser. With his small band of people, because I think at the most that they ever had was Herb and 2 or 3 other people, they managed to put out a pretty good magazine for many years, although certainly towards the last 4 or 5 years, it was referred to as a pamphlet rather than a magazine. I think at some points probably down at 10 or 12 or not more than 16 pages. Certainly it was sad as that was occurring, and sad to see that this once great publication was going the way of the dodo bird. Move quickly forward, and we now have a new magazine, MH Pro, and other e-magazines that Tony Kovac has brought onto the internet. These are wonderful, wonderful industry resources, and Tony has got to be given a tremendous amount of credit for the immense amount of industry information that he provides. News updates, publications on industry players, the new purchases, old sales, and I think the thing that most people like is interviews with certain people, a cup of coffee. And I think they also like people who kind of just sit down one day and have something they want to say, and they write Tony, and Tony lets them vent. In many cases, they're very, very good articles which allow an industry conversation, which in a small industry like ours doesn't get as much opportunity to be circulated as it might in, let's say, the realtor world as an example. So all of us look for the new articles, which seem to come on primarily at the beginning of each monthly period. And during those periods of time, we read what the people who are being interviewed by Tony have to say about the industry. And while there's a kind of common tangent to what's going on people's minds, by no means are all people of the same belief on where the industry's going and the strengths of the industry and what the industry future is. To say that there's quite a divergence of opinions on that point, frankly, is an understatement. I personally have written for Tony a number of times. I was a very, very frequent contributor for the manufactured housing merchandiser. And I guess the question that comes to a lot of people's minds, particularly those who were manufactured housing merchandiser readers as I was, what are the differences? What are the strengths of each? Who was doing what? Let's start with the merchandiser first. Herb rarely did a lot of writing. He might have the frontispiece for an opinion piece, but often that was done by one of his people rather than Herb. That doesn't mean that Herb didn't do it. It just means that he didn't do it all the time. And the magazine, that is the merchandiser magazine, in terms of content, even when it used to be a pretty thick, glossy magazine, had just a small fraction of the material that's available for MH Pro and MH Living. So I think if we're contrasting those 2 points, there is no question that Tony's e-magazine is on an order of magnitude several times greater than the manufactured housing merchandiser ever reached, even at the height of its popularity when the industry was selling 300 to 379,000 homes a year, and the money was flowing for advertising, and there was plenty of information to go around, and plenty of conferences to report on, and plenty of shows like Nashville and others to report upon. And certainly the merchandiser did that and did that well. Not as well as it's being done today by Tony's. Now, if we get to Tony's, it is on the internet, so it's easy to access. You can look at it day and night. You don't have to wait for it to come out. It appears on your desk there, on your desktop. It's easy to read. Tony always has plenty to say himself, so we can follow what he's up to. And he has plenty of other people who have plenty to say, and we can follow them. And I think from the feedback that I've gotten from some of the articles, a lot of people read this stuff and are interested in it. I think to some degree because there's not a lot of publications left that are doing any of this, so it's now come down to Tony's e-magazine to be the purveyor of most industry knowledge, if not the only one, certainly the preeminent one. At some point during the early part to the middle part of the 2000s, I very much became interested in buying the merchandiser. I like to write, and I'm always a man of plenty of opinions, endless, right or wrong, I've got them. And I sat down with Herb, who was a minority partner in the enterprise, and his majority partner, who was a trade magazine publisher and dealt in other areas and essentially had Herb run the merchandiser. We sat down and tried to structure a deal. At the time we first spoke, the magazine price was still fairly high. And interestingly enough, about 5 years earlier, at the very height of the manufactured housing craze in the late 1990s, they had dabbled with some offers they had received that were truly eye-popping in terms of much money people were willing to pay for the merchandiser. Well, of course, as shipments slid from 373,000 to 250,000 to 125,000 to God knows where by the time the merchandiser went out, the value of the commodity, which was the merchandiser, had reduced substantially. I think in the final time we spoke, which was just a short time before the merchandiser ceased publication, I think essentially what they were saying to me is they would have liked to have seen the merchandiser survive and that I could name my terms on how to take the magazine over. I think unfortunately by that term I have kind of come to the decision that there wasn't really much to salvage there, and I didn't think that it could really be done all that well. I think one of the things that really hamstrung the merchandiser is that even though Wayne and Chris Olvera had attempted to convince Herb to do an internet magazine and get the merchandiser online, he wouldn't hear of it. Like many of us who get into older age and times passes by, Herb just didn't really see the value to it. And I think if he'd have gotten on board with an internet magazine, or at least turned the merchandiser into it, the enormous shipping costs that they had and a lot of other costs that they had in terms of distributing the magazine could well have disappeared and allowed the merchandiser to continue, because even though advertising was thin by the end, there probably was maybe still enough so they could have done something. And I think probably to some degree the merchandiser staff was really no longer very aggressive in soliciting new advertising help, and during the good days it seemed to come by itself, and during the bad days it ceased, and very little effort that I could see was being made to bring on new advertisers. So do I lament that the merchandiser has disappeared? Yeah, I sure do. I'm not sure that in my mind or in my heart that any other publication will ever replace it. It was just part of the 30 or 40 years that I was in the industry, a very important part of it. I tried to buy it. I was in tune well with the people who ran it, and I was always impressed by the longevity of history of the magazine. Sitting on one of the top shelves in their small office in downtown Chicago was a shelf which seemed endlessly, which had a copy of every issue that had ever been published. And let me tell you, a lot of issues have been published. I still wonder sometimes what happened to that tremendous archive of industry matters going back to the day the first one was published to the day publication ceased. It's too bad that they couldn't find a home somewhere such as Manufactured Housing Institute or somebody else who could house those archives so that in the future, if the industry would rebound strong enough so people cared about the history of the industry, I'm not exactly sure where they could find a better archive than in all those manufactured housing merchandisers on those shelves for all those many years. What about Tony's magazine? Well, it's a pretty special effort. There's no question the man has really outstripped himself in terms of presenting to the industry information, chatter, rumors, news, anything that he can get up there that he thinks might be of interest. And I'm not exactly sure Tony also has a pretty small staff, just as Herb did, and I'm not exactly sure how in heaven's name they get as much stuff up on that e-magazine as they do, but it's a pretty awesome amount of monthly information that comes out. And Tony himself and his writing is prodigious. I know how long it takes to do this stuff. He just cranks it out. He must get up and with a mission every day and must sit down at his keyboard and away he goes. And do I agree with everything Tony says? Not any more than he agrees with everything I say. But I do respect his opinions, and I do respect the volume of work he puts out, and there's no question in finality that this is not only the preeminent manufactured housing industry magazine of the current day, it is without a doubt the very finest industry magazine that I personally have ever had the pride and privilege of reading, seeing, writing for, and watching the impact it had on manufactured housing. Congratulations to Tony and his team. They seem to get better every month that goes by, and I'm sure that a new archive is being written, which will someday also be part of that long legacy that the manufactured housing merchandiser set forth all those many years.